Welcome to the cozy mystery parlor, where villages appear peaceful and secrets learn to speak softly. In this one, a woman was buried on a Tuesday. The church bells rang, the coffin was lowered, and the villagers went home. Only for the bells to ring again 3 days later for another coffin, another funeral, the same name carved into stone. And when Mrs. Elowen Hartley asked how such a thing could happen, she was met not with confusion, but with silence, because everyone knew the truth and hoped it would remain buried. So settle in now. Let the world outside soften and drift away, because tonight we return to a village that held 2 funerals and a mystery Mrs. Elowen Hartley could not ignore. Chapter 1. When the Bell Rang Twice. The bell rang late, which was the first thing Mrs. Elowen Hartley noticed, because in a village like Roseford, bells were never late without reason. They rang on time for weddings, on time for Sunday service, and on time for death especially. Roseford prided itself on order, and endings were expected to arrive punctually. So when the sound drifted across the green a full 3 minutes behind expectation, Mrs. Hartley paused at her gate and listened again, certain at first that she had miscounted. She had not. The bell corrected itself eventually, as though embarrassed, and the village resumed its movement, but something had already shifted, subtly, like a picture frame nudged out of alignment. The funeral was held at St. Bridget's, as funerals in Roseford always were. The church stood with its usual dignity, gray stone softened by age and habit, its doors already open to admit the quiet stream of villagers approaching with measured steps and lowered voices. Grief here was conducted carefully. It was expected to be tidy. Mrs. Hartley arrived early, not from eagerness but from preference. Arriving at the same time as everyone else invited conversation, and conversation in Roseford was rarely about what it appeared to be. She took her place 3 rows from the front, near enough to see, far enough not to be noticed. The coffin rested beneath a simple arrangement of white lilies, nothing extravagant. Roseford disapproved of excess at funerals. Loss was to be acknowledged, not displayed. The name on the order of service read, Clara Whitfield, aged 26. 26, Mrs. Hartley thought, old enough to be expected to manage on one's own, young enough to be spoken of gently, as though fragility explained everything. People arrived in pairs, as they always did. 2 women who were not particularly friends, but equally unwilling to arrive alone. A married couple who had walked in silence, but now touched each other's elbows for reassurance. A man in a dark scarf who glanced too quickly at the coffin and then away, as though caught staring at something indecent. Mrs. Hartley watched without appearing to. That was her particular skill. She sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression composed, indistinguishable from any other respectable villager. But she noticed how people approached the coffin and how they did not. Some paused, heads bowed with genuine weight. Some made a brief show of it, like a bow to a portrait, and some did not look at it at all. The vicar moved about with practiced softness, his voice gentle, his manner carefully bright. Grief here was not merely an emotion, it was a performance, and everyone feared forgetting their lines. When he spoke of youth, of loss, of the mystery of God's timing. He did not speak of how Clara Whitfield had died. The word hovered anyway, unspoken but unmistakable, like a draft along the stone floor. Suicide. The family entered last. Clara's mother walked with her spine held painfully straight, her face set in the stillness of someone who had cried enough to exhaust the body, but not the mind. Beside her walked a man Mrs. Hartley did not immediately recognize, an uncle perhaps, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed ahead as though movement itself required effort. Behind them came a young woman in a black dress, her hair pinned with care that bordered on severity. Too careful, Mrs. Hartley thought. They took their places in the front pew. Clara's mother folded and unfolded her gloved hands in her lap, again and again, as though quietly counting something only she could see. When the first hymn ended, those hands stopped. Clara Whitfield turned her head, not toward the coffin nor the vicar, but toward the congregation, toward the village. Her eyes moved slowly across the pews, searching. Mrs. Hartley felt a chill settle behind her ribs, the kind that had nothing to do with the cold stone walls. Near the side aisle stood Inspector Reed, not in uniform, his coat buttoned to the throat, his hat held low in his hands. He watched the people, not the service. When his eyes met Mrs. Hartley's, his expression shifted by a fraction, recognition, resignation, and something like warning. The bell rang again as the service drew to its close. This time it rang on time, but Roseford, Mrs. Hartley knew, was not. Chapter 2. Polite Grief and Watching Eyes. The wake was held, as most things in Roseford were, at the parish hall. By the time Mrs. Elowen Hartley arrived, the long tables had already been arranged with quiet precision. White cloths smoothed flat, plates of shortbread stacked neatly, slices of fruit loaf cut evenly enough to suggest supervision. A large urn hissed softly in the corner, releasing the familiar, slightly medicinal scent of overbrewed tea. Grief, in Roseford, was expected to circulate politely. People stood in small clusters, cups held in both hands, shoulders angled toward one another. Voices were lowered, words softened, as though the walls themselves might take offense at anything spoken too plainly. Mrs. Hartley accepted a cup she did not particularly want and positioned herself near the edge of the room, where one could observe without interrupting the flow. No one questioned her distance. In a village, a woman standing slightly apart at a wake was assumed to be modest, sorrowful, or simply old. She waited before truly looking. Rooms revealed more when allowed to settle. Clara Whitfield's family sat together near the window. Her mother had not removed her coat. It clung to her slight frame like armor. The teacup in her hands remained untouched, her gaze fixed on a point just beyond the far wall. A man beside her, Clara's uncle, Mrs. Hartley suspected, leaned in from time to murmur something meant to reassure. Mrs. Whitfield did not always respond. Across the room stood a young woman in a plain black dress, her back resting lightly against the wall. She spoke quietly to those who approached her, smiling at the appropriate moments, nodding when expected. But her eyes moved often, toward the door, then back again, waiting. Mrs. Hartley followed her gaze. Margaret Belaine had arrived without announcement. She moved through the hall with the ease of someone accustomed to being noticed but never challenged. Her dark coat was perfectly pressed, her hair pinned neatly away from her face. When she offered condolences, she did so with both hands lightly enclosing the other person's fingers, intimate, reassuring, unmistakably deliberate. People made space for her without realizing they were doing it. Mrs. Hartley watched as Margaret Belaine approached Clara's mother. The exchange was brief. Mrs. Whitfield stiffened visibly, her jaw tightening, her fingers finally curling around the teacup as though it were something solid to hold on to. Margaret inclined her head, murmured something that looked like kindness, and stepped away before the moment could deepen into anything uncomfortable. She did not look shaken. Inspector Reed stood near the notice board, pretending to read parish announcements that had not been updated in years. He had mastered the art of appearing unoccupied while remaining entirely alert. When Margaret passed him, she paused. "Inspector," she said warmly,
"I didn't expect to see you here." "No?" Reed replied, equally pleasant. "Well," she continued, lowering her voice just enough to suggest discretion, "it's been such a difficult time for the family. I hope your presence won't add to their distress." Reed met her eyes. "I hope," he said, "that clarity never does." Margaret smiled, a fraction too smoothly. Mrs. Hartley noted it. She drifted closer to the refreshment table, listening as though idly. "It's such a shame," one woman murmured. "So young," another replied. "Troubled, though," a third added quickly, then glanced around as if checking whether the word had been permitted. No one contradicted her. "That poor girl," someone said. "She never really settled here." Mrs. Hartley lifted her eyes. "Didn't she?" she asked gently. The women turned, startled, then softened when they recognized her. Mrs. Hartley had that effect on people. She looked like someone's questions were safe. "Well," one said after a pause, "you know how these things are. Some people just don't fit." "And yet," Mrs. Hartley replied mildly, "she grew up here." The silence that followed was not long, but it was instructive. Across the room, Margaret Belaine laughed softly at something a man had said to her. It was not an unkind laugh. It was simply well-timed. Mrs. Hartley felt the outline of something begin to form, not a conclusion, not yet, but a shape. Clara Whitfield had been spoken of kindly, vaguely, and always at a distance, as though she belonged to the village only in theory. Inspector Reed approached her a few minutes later, cup in hand. "You're listening," he said quietly. "Always," Mrs. Hartley replied. "The coroner's report is straightforward. No signs of struggle, no note, but nothing to suggest coercion." "And yet?" Mrs. Hartley prompted. Reed glanced, without appearing to, toward Margaret. "And yet," he said, "too many people here seem to be relieved." Mrs. Hartley followed his gaze. Margaret stood now with the vicar, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her expression earnest and concerned. To anyone watching casually, she looked like a woman doing exactly what was expected of her. "What troubles me," Mrs. Hartley said softly, "is that Clara died." Reed looked sharply. "It's that everyone seems to agree why, without ever saying it." Reed exhaled slowly. "Stay observant," he said, "but be careful." Mrs. Hartley allowed herself a small, polite smile. In a village like Roseford, carefulness is how things like this happen. As the wake thinned and people began to drift away, Mrs. Hartley noticed Margaret pause near the door. She looked back, once, just once, toward the family, the tables, the crumbs of cake and carefully managed grief. Then she left, and in her absence, the room felt subtly different, lighter. Mrs. Hartley wrapped her hands around her untouched cup of tea. That, she thought, was not the feeling of a tragedy concluded. It was the feeling of a danger temporarily past. And those, she knew, were always the most dangerous kinds.
Chapter 3. The Years No One Kept. Mrs. Hartley did not go home directly after the wake. She walked instead toward the older end of Roseford, where the lanes narrowed and the cottages leaned a little closer together, as though sharing confidences. Clara Whitfield had lived there, number 12 on Alder Lane, behind a low green gate that never quite latched unless it was lifted before closing. Mrs. Hartley knew this because she had tried it once, months earlier, when Clara was still alive and standing in her doorway, apologizing for the inconvenience of being in the way. The gate was closed now, locked this time. The windows were dark. A letting notice had been taped to the inside of the glass, its corners curling already with damp. Available immediately. Mrs. Hartley stood there a moment longer than politeness required, then turned back toward the village center. Her next stop was the place where lives in Roseford were officially remembered, or more precisely, summarized. The records room occupied a narrow annex behind the parish office. It smelled faintly of dust and furniture polish, and the radiator clicked with the steady irritation of something that had never worked properly. Shelves lined the walls, filled with lever arch files and bound registers, their spines labeled in tidy, uniform handwriting. Mrs. Hartley had helped organize them years ago when the parish council decided the room needed bringing into order. She still remembered where things were kept. She signed the visitor's book, her name neat and unremarkable, and moved quietly along the shelves. Whitfield, Clara. The folder was thin. Too thin. Inside were the expected papers, a birth record, school enrollment, a note of residence changes. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would trouble anyone glancing through in a hurry. And yet, Mrs. Hartley frowned. There were gaps. Between Clara's 19th birthday and her 23rd year, the file held almost nothing at all. No address updates, no employment notes, no correspondence. It was as though those years had been lifted out carefully and set aside. She removed a second folder at random, another young woman of similar age, raised in the village, still living there. That file was thicker, messier, alive with small, inconsequential details. Life, Mrs. Hartley knew, rarely arranged itself so neatly. The comparison was instructive. "Looking for something in particular?" Mrs. Hartley turned. Margaret Belaine stood in the doorway. She had not heard her approach. Margaret's expression was pleasant, curious, entirely appropriate. She held a folder beneath one arm, as though she had simply happened upon Mrs. Hartley by chance. "I was," Mrs. Hartley said calmly, "refreshing my memory." Margaret smiled. "You've always had a good one." She stepped inside, her shoes making no sound on the worn carpet. Her eyes flicked briefly to the open file on the desk. "Clara's records," she said lightly. "Such a sad business." "Yes," Mrs. Hartley replied. "I find it helpful to understand a person's life as a whole." Margaret nodded. "Of course, though sometimes focusing too closely on details can make things seem more complicated than they truly are." Mrs. Hartley met her gaze. "I've always found," she said gently, "that complications exist whether we acknowledge them or not." Margaret's smile did not fade, but something behind it cooled. "Well, we all do what we can for the village. Clara was a sensitive girl. Some people struggle more than others." "Do they?" Mrs. Hartley asked. Margaret hesitated, only briefly. "I helped where I could, as did many others, but there are limits. We cannot save everyone." Mrs. Hartley closed the file. "No," she said quietly, "but we can decide how much room they're allowed to take up." Margaret studied her for a moment longer than politeness required, then inclined her head. "If you'll excuse me, I have other matters to attend to." She left as quietly as she had arrived. Mrs. Hartley remained where she was, her fingers resting lightly on the closed folder. A life, she thought, could be edited without anyone noticing, not by tearing pages out, but by deciding which ones were worth keeping. When Inspector Reed arrived later that afternoon, she told him what she had found. 4 missing years, he said, his brow creasing. "People move, records get lost." "But not like this," Mrs. Hartley replied. "This was arranged." Reed looked sharply at her. "By whom?" Mrs. Hartley did not answer immediately. She glanced instead toward the doorway Margaret Belaine had used. "In Roseford, things don't vanish by accident. Someone decides they are no longer useful." Reed exhaled slowly. "And Clara?" Mrs. Hartley's voice was steady. "Someone decided," she said, "that her story took up too much space." Outside, the village moved into evening. Lights appeared in windows. Kettles were filled.
Conversations resumed. And somewhere within Roseford's careful order, a truth waited, quietly, for someone to notice that it had been removed.
Chapter 4. Help Carefully Given. Roseford liked to think of itself as generous. It held fetes for distant causes, knitted blankets for hospitals it would never see, and collected tins of food every winter with admirable efficiency. Kindness here was practical and visible, something that could be logged, thanked, and neatly concluded. Mrs. Hartley knew this because she had once helped keep the records. The parish office was quiet that afternoon, the sort of quiet that carried the faint hum of a building settling into itself. The secretary had gone home early with a headache, leaving behind a mug ring on the desk and a note that read, "Back tomorrow." Mrs. Hartley did not feel as though she were trespassing. Roseford had long since accepted her as part of its furniture, useful, unobtrusive, and rarely questioned. She opened the cupboard beneath the notice board and drew out a thick cloth-bound ledger. Community Support and Assistance. The words were stamped on the cover in fading ink. Inside, the pages were filled with neat entries: grocery deliveries, short-term lodging, emergency grants, temporary arrangements, names, dates, amounts. The handwriting changed every few pages, but the tone never did. Helpful, efficient, final. Mrs. Hartley turned the pages slowly. There it was. Whitfield, C. Assistance provided following personal difficulties. Duration, limited. Outcome, resolved. Resolved. Mrs. Hartley closed her eyes briefly. Resolved was a word Roseford used when it wished to believe something had ended cleanly. It was not a word that described people. She traced the entry with one finger, then examined the margin. A small mark sat beside the name, a star lightly penciled. Margaret Belane's System. Mrs. Hartley had seen it years ago when Margaret had taken over organizing village welfare efforts. The star meant special attention. It meant a matter requiring discretion, not support, control. She flipped back through the ledger, searching for other stars. There were several. Few names repeated. None belonged to people who still lived comfortably in Roseford. A pattern did not announce itself. It never did. It waited. Later that evening, Inspector Reed joined her at the small table by the window. He brought sandwiches neither of them particularly wanted, and the look of a man whose patience was wearing thin. "This," Mrs. Hartley said, tapping the ledger gently, "is how Clara was managed." Reed read the entry, his jaw tightening. "They helped her," he said carefully. "Food, housing, temporary aid. That isn't a crime." "No," Mrs. Hartley agreed, "but help that arrives with conditions often does more harm than neglect." Reed looked up. "What conditions?" Mrs. Hartley turned the page. Silence, compliance, gratitude. She explained the stars, the missing years, the way assistance ended abruptly, always with that final, soothing word, resolved. Reed leaned back in his chair and stared out the window at the neat row of cottages opposite the hall. "So Margaret gives help, and people leave shortly after." "Not leave," Mrs. Hartley corrected gently. "They're persuaded it's best for everyone." Reed exhaled. "That's still not murder," he said. "No," Mrs. Hartley replied, "but it is the shaping of a life. And when you shape someone into a corner with no exits—" She did not finish the sentence. Reed didn't ask her to. The door opened quietly, and Margaret Belane entered as though summoned by the thought of her. She smiled when she saw them. "I wondered who still had the light on.
Working late? Just reading, Reed replied. Margaret's eyes flicked to the ledger, not alarmed, but assessing. Oh, that old thing, she said lightly. We do try to keep our kindness organized. I noticed, Mrs. Hartley said. Margaret met her gaze without blinking. Kindness needs structure, otherwise it becomes chaos, and chaos helps no one. And Clara? Mrs. Hartley asked. Margaret's smile softened. Clara, she said, was given every opportunity. The words were precise, finished. Reed stood. I'll be in touch, he said. Margaret inclined her head. Of course. As she left, Mrs. Hartley closed the ledger. Kindness, she thought, could be used like a blade, clean, quiet, and never visibly stained. And Clara Whitfield had not been cut down by cruelty, but by a system that insisted it knew what was best.
Chapter 5. The Night She Asked to Stay. By the time Mrs. Elowen Hartley reached the cottage on Alder Lane, the light had thinned into evening. Roseford did not fall into darkness all at once. It faded in layers, each street surrendering a little earlier than the last. The cottage belonged to Mrs. Agnes Whitcomb. Everyone in Roseford knew her, though few knew her well. She had lived in the same place for nearly 40 years, taught half the village to read in a firm but patient hand, and possessed a memory that was inconveniently accurate. People admired that sort of thing from a distance. Mrs. Hartley knocked. There was a pause. Footsteps, slow, careful. Then the door opened a fraction. "Oh," Mrs. Whitcomb said, surprised. "Mrs. Hartley." "I hope I'm not intruding," Mrs. Hartley replied. "I wondered if I might come in for a moment." Mrs. Whitcomb hesitated, then stepped aside. The door opened fully. The cottage smelled of lavender polish and old books. A fire burned low in the grate. Everything was tidy in the way of someone who kept order not from pride, but because disorder unsettled her. They sat at the small kitchen table. Tea appeared without discussion. Mrs. Hartley did not begin immediately. She never did. She allowed the silence to stretch just long enough to become uncomfortable. "You were close to Clara," she said at last. Mrs. Whitcomb's hand tightened around her cup. "I helped her with reading when she was younger, that was all." "Was it?" Mrs. Hartley asked gently. Mrs. Whitcomb looked up sharply, then away. "She used to come here," she said after a moment, "when she was unsure." "Unsure of what?" Mrs. Hartley asked. Mrs. Whitcomb inhaled slowly. "Of whether she was welcome," she said. The words settled heavily between them. "People say she left," Mrs. Hartley prompted. "Yes, that's what people say. And what do you say?" Mrs. Whitcomb's eyes shone, not with tears, but with restrained irritation. "I say she was encouraged," she said, very politely. Mrs. Hartley waited. "She was told," Mrs. Whitcomb continued, "that Roseford might not be the best place for her anymore, that fresh starts were healthy, that distance could be healing." Mrs. Hartley nodded. She had heard those phrases before. They were cushions meant to soften a fall. "Who told her this?" Mrs. Hartley asked. Mrs. Whitcomb hesitated. "I won't name names," she said, "but there were meetings, conversations, people she trusted." "Margaret Belaine?" Mrs. Hartley asked quietly. Mrs. Whitcomb did not answer. That, Mrs. Hartley knew, was an answer. "She came to me the night before she left," Mrs. Whitcomb said suddenly. "She was shaking, said she'd been told that staying would only make things worse, for her mother, for the village." Her voice dropped. "She asked me if she was bad." Mrs. Hartley closed her eyes briefly. "And what did you tell her?" she asked. "I told her she was young and tired, and that people sometimes confuse discomfort with wrongdoing." Her mouth tightened.
But I didn't tell her to stay. Mrs. Hartley met her gaze. No, she said softly, you didn't. The silence returned, heavier now. After she left, Mrs. Hartley asked, did anyone check on her? Mrs. Whitcomb gave a short, humorless laugh. Oh, yes, she said, in a way. There were updates, quiet ones, passed along like reassurances. She's managing. She's found work. She's better off. And did you believe them? Mrs. Hartley asked. Mrs. Whitcomb shook her head. I believed that the village needed them to be true. Mrs. Hartley stood to leave a few minutes later. At the door she paused. Thank you, she said, for remembering. Mrs. Whitcomb's voice followed her. Someone should. If everyone forgets, then she really has gone. Outside, the air had cooled. Mrs. Hartley walked slowly, her thoughts careful and exact. Clara Whitfield had not vanished. She had been removed, gently, cooperatively, and with everyone's consent. And now she was dead. When Inspector Reed arrived at Mrs. Hartley's cottage later that night, she told him what she had learned. So she didn't leave, he said quietly. No, Mrs. Hartley replied. She was escorted. Reed stared at the floor. That changes things, he said. Yes, Mrs. Hartley agreed. It means she didn't die because she was alone. Reed looked up. She died, Mrs. Hartley finished, because too many people stood close enough to push. Outside, Roseford settled into sleep, unaware that one of its most comfortable lies had begun to loosen.
Chapter 6. The Second Bell. Mrs. Hartley did not sleep well. Not because she feared anyone in Roseford. Fear was too loud for this village, but because her mind refused to accept neatness where it did not belong. The funeral had been too smooth, the grief too disciplined, the silences too practiced. In the early hours she lay awake and listened to the house settle, the old pipes clicking softly as they cooled, the wind combing the hedge like fingers searching for a gap. By morning, she had decided something simple. If the village wanted her to stop looking, it should have tried harder. She was pouring the kettle when the first whisper arrived, carried on the voice of Mrs. Pritchard from across the lane, a woman who treated every new detail like a sacred object that must be handled carefully. "Have you heard?" Mrs. Pritchard said, as if speaking too loudly might crack it. "They've put another notice up." Mrs. Hartley held her teacup steady. "Another notice?" "At St. Bridget's," Mrs. Pritchard continued, "on the board. It's odd." "Odd in what way?" Mrs. Hartley asked, though she already suspected. Mrs. Pritchard swallowed. "It's her name again." The kettle clicked off behind Mrs. Hartley, sharp in the quiet. "Whose?" she asked, politely, as if she did not know. "Clara Whitfield," Mrs. Pritchard said. A pause followed, short but heavy with the private shame of saying it aloud. "Perhaps they've made a mistake," Mrs. Hartley replied. Mrs. Pritchard's voice dropped even lower. "They haven't." And then she was gone, retreating into her own cottage, as though even sharing the news might attach it to her. Mrs. Hartley put on her coat and walked. Roseford was bright that morning in the way villages often were after a funeral, as if the weather itself had been asked to behave. The green looked properly swept by the wind, the hedges were trimmed, even the birds seemed to keep to polite distances. Outside St. Bridget's, the notice board was already surrounded by a small, carefully spaced cluster of villagers, no one too close, no one quite touching the subject. Mrs. Hartley approached as though she had every reason to be there. The paper was pinned neatly under the glass. Service of Commendation, Clara Whitfield, aged 26. Date, Thursday, time 11 a.m.
Mrs. Hartley read it twice, not because she could not understand the words, but because her mind insisted on searching for a hidden correction, an apology, an explanation, a sign that reality had not slipped its hinge. There was none. And the people standing around her did not react like people witnessing impossibility. They did not laugh. They did not argue. They did not ask loudly what on earth it meant. They murmured. They frowned. They looked away, the way people did when something had already been decided and it was impolite to pretend otherwise. A woman beside her said softly, "It's for the family." "As if that makes it sensible," another replied. "No," the first said, almost sharply, "as if that makes it necessary." Mrs. Hartley turned her head slightly towards her. "Is there a reason to bury someone twice?" she asked, gentle enough to pass his curiosity. The women looked at her, startled, and then, when they recognized who she was, their faces softened in a way that almost resembled relief. "That's not what it is," one said quickly. "Then what is it?" A hesitation. And then, because villagers preferred vague truth to clear lies, one offered, "There were complications." Mrs. Hartley nodded as though she understood. Complications in Roseford was a word used to stop questions from multiplying. She walked into the church. It was empty but not unused. The air held the faint waxy smell of candles and the damp sweetness of old stone. Someone had been there recently. There was a fresh arrangement on the front table, half finished, white lilies still wrapped at the stems. The same lilies. That alone might have meant nothing, and yet it felt deliberate, as though the village wanted the second funeral to look like the first, so the mind would accept it without resistance. Mrs. Hartley put on her coat and walked. Roseford was bright that morning in the way villages often were after a funeral, as if the weather itself had been asked to behave. The green looked properly swept by the wind, the hedges were trimmed, even the birds seemed to keep to polite distances. Outside St. Bridget's, the notice board was already surrounded by a small, carefully spaced cluster of villagers. No one too close, no one quite touching the subject. Mrs. Hartley approached as though she had every reason to be there. The paper was pinned neatly under the glass. Service of Commendation, Clara Whitfield, aged 26. Date, Thursday. Time, 11 a.m. Mrs. Hartley read it twice, not because she could not understand the words, but because her mind insisted on searching for a hidden correction, an apology, an explanation, a sign that reality had not slipped its hinge. There was none. And the people standing around her did not react like people witnessing impossibility. They did not laugh. They did not argue. They did not ask loudly what on earth it meant. They murmured. They frowned. They looked away, the way people did when something had already been decided and it was impolite to pretend otherwise. A woman beside her said softly, "It's for the family." "As if that makes it sensible," another replied. "No," the first said, almost sharply, "as if that makes it necessary." Mrs. Hartley turned her head slightly towards her. "Is there a reason to bury someone twice?" she asked, gentle enough to pass his curiosity. The women looked at her, startled, and then, when they recognized who she was, their faces softened in a way that almost resembled relief. "That's not what it is," one said quickly. "Then what is it?" A hesitation. And then, because villagers preferred vague truth to clear lies, one offered, "There were complications." Mrs. Hartley nodded as though she understood. Complications in Roseford was a word used to stop questions from multiplying. She walked into the church. It was empty but not unused. The air held the faint waxy smell of candles and the damp sweetness of old stone. Someone had been there recently. There was a fresh arrangement on the front table, half finished, white lilies still wrapped at the stems. The same lilies. That alone might have meant nothing, and yet it felt deliberate, as though the village wanted the second funeral to look like the first, so the mind would accept it without resistance. Mrs. Hartley was still standing there when the vicar appeared from the side door, keys in hand, surprise flickering across his face like a shadow. "Mrs. Hartley," he said quickly. "Good morning." "Good morning," she replied. "I saw the notice." A faint tightening at the corners of his mouth. "Yes," he said, "it's unfortunate." "Is it a mistake?" Mrs. Hartley asked. The vicar looked down at his keys as if they might answer for him. "No," he said quietly, "it isn't." Mrs. Hartley let a small pause stretch between them, just long enough to become uncomfortable. "Then why?" she asked. The vicar's shoulders rose and fell with a shallow breath. "The family requested it." "And you agreed?" Mrs. Hartley asked. He forced a polite expression into place. "In times of grief, we try to accommodate what brings comfort." Mrs. Hartley studied him. Grief did many things to people, but it rarely made them speak like parish minutes. "Comfort," she repeated. The vicar did not meet her eyes. "Will the coffin be opened?" she asked. His head snapped up too fast. "No," he said at once, then softened it. "It will remain sealed." "Why sealed?" Mrs. Hartley asked. His mouth worked, searching for a reason that could survive daylight. "It's best," he said finally. There it was again. Best. Mrs. Hartley gave him a small, respectful nod. "And who decided that?" she asked, as if asking whether the kettle should be set to boil. The vicar's gaze flicked, just once, toward the vestry door, not toward the altar, not toward heaven, toward a room where decisions were made by people, not God. Mrs. Hartley thanked him and left without pressing further. Outside, the villagers were already returning to their routines, walking dogs, collecting parcels, chatting in soft circles that dissolved when approached. But something had changed, not the village's movement, the village's weight. At the edge of the green, beneath the bare-limbed chestnut tree, Inspector Reed stood with his coat collar turned up against the wind. He looked like a man who had walked out of one reality and into another without being consulted. Mrs. Hartley approached. He didn't pretend surprise. "You saw it," he said. "I did," she replied. Reed's jaw tightened. "They filed it properly. Council minutes, church permissions. The whole thing has a paper trail, as if that makes it normal."
Mrs. Hartley's gaze rested on his face. "Whose idea was it?" Reed hesitated. "That's the thing," he said. "No one is admitting it was theirs. The request came from the family. The vicar says the same. The undertaker says he was told to prepare. The council says it's not their business." "And Clara's mother?" Mrs. Hartley asked. Reed's eyes hardened. "She didn't ask for it," he said quietly. "Not in any way I recognize as asking." Mrs. Hartley felt something settle behind her ribs, cold and steady. "A second funeral," she said slowly, "is not comfort. No, it's control." They stood a moment, watching the village act normal. "How does one bury the same person twice?" Mrs. Hartley asked softly. Reed exhaled through his nose, a sound like restraint. "You don't," he said. "Not legally. Not truly. Not unless—" "Unless what?" Mrs. Hartley asked. Reed's voice dropped. "Unless the first coffin wasn't right." Mrs. Hartley turned her head slightly toward him. "Not right in what way?" she asked. Reed didn't answer immediately. His eyes moved across the green, over the churchyard gate, to the neat line of cottages where people made tea and pretended their lives were simple. "Wait," he said finally. "The undertaker's log. The first coffin was lighter than it should have been." Mrs. Hartley held perfectly still. "Could it have been empty?" she asked. Reed's eyes met hers. "It could," he said. A faint wind moved through the branches above them, and the chestnut tree creaked softly, like a warning trying not to be heard.
Mrs. Hartley watched a child cross the green with a skipping rope, carefree, as though the earth beneath Roseford had never swallowed anyone. "If the first coffin was empty," she said carefully, "then the first funeral wasn't about burying Clara." Reed nodded once. "It was about burying questions," he said. Mrs. Hartley's voice was calm when she spoke again, but something in it had sharpened. "And the second funeral?" she asked. Reed looked toward the church. "The second funeral," he said quietly, "is what happens when someone worries the questions might come back up." Mrs. Hartley felt her hands tighten inside her gloves. "In Roseford, people do not bury someone twice by mistake." Reed's gaze stayed fixed on the church door. "No," he agreed, "they do it when they need a story to hold." A bell began to ring in the distance, practice perhaps, or the vicar testing rope and rhythm. Mrs. Hartley listened to it, her face composed. It sounded ordinary, which she realized was the most frightening thing of all, because in Roseford, even the impossible could be made to sound like routine. And somewhere behind that routine, someone was preparing to lower a second coffin into the ground. This time, on time. This time, sealed. This time.
Chapter 7. What was buried first? Inspector Reed did not announce his next steps. In Roseford, announcements created resistance. Quiet movement created results. By mid-morning, the village had accepted the idea of the second funeral without openly discussing it. Acceptance here did not require understanding, only repetition. The notice stayed on the board. The time remained fixed. People adjusted their schedules. Mrs. Hartley watched it happen from her front window, noting how quickly impossibility became routine. "The village," she murmured, "has always preferred comfort to coherence." Reed arrived just after 11, his coat damp from a walk taken without destination. He did not sit at once. He stood near the mantelpiece, studying the framed photograph of Mrs. Hartley's late husband, as though grounding himself in something honest. "I've spoken to the undertaker," he said. Mrs. Hartley poured tea. "And?" "He's careful," Reed replied. "Careful enough to survive a place like this. He keeps records, but he keeps his opinions to himself." "That usually means he knows something," Mrs. Hartley said. Reed nodded. "The first coffin arrived sealed, not unusual, but it was sealed before it reached Roseford." Mrs. Hartley paused. "Meaning Clara was never viewed?" "No. Family viewing, no private confirmation. Everything was handled through intermediaries." "And the weight?" Mrs. Hartley asked. Reed's mouth tightened. "The undertaker weighed it when he logged it. Habit," he said. "The coffin was lighter than expected." "Empty?" Mrs. Hartley asked. "Not empty," Reed replied, "but not right." Mrs. Hartley set the teapot down carefully. "What was inside?" Reed exhaled slowly. "Something consistent with a coffin being symbolic." The word lingered between them. "Symbolic of what?" Mrs. Hartley asked. Reed looked at her. "Closure, compliance, finality." Mrs. Hartley felt a quiet certainty settle into place. "So the first funeral," she said, "was never meant to bury Clara." "No," Reed replied. "It was meant to end questions." They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the clock on the wall mark time without opinion. "And the second funeral?" Mrs. Hartley asked. Reed's gaze dropped. "The second funeral is correction." He leaned forward now, elbows on knees, voice lower. Something disrupted the original arrangement. Someone became nervous. Records were checked, logs were revisited, and now they want certainty. "Which requires a body," Mrs. Hartley said softly. "Yes," Reed replied, "one that can be accounted for." Mrs. Hartley looked out the window toward the green,
where two women paused mid-conversation as though sensing they were being observed. "In Roseford," she said, "people rarely do something twice unless the first attempt failed." Reed stood. "I need access to the cemetery records." Mrs. Hartley nodded. "You won't be given it easily." "No," Reed agreed, "but I'll be given something." He paused at the door. "If the first coffin wasn't right, then Clara wasn't where the village said she was," Mrs. Hartley finished. Reed didn't correct her. That afternoon, Roseford tightened further. Mrs. Hartley noticed doors closing earlier, conversations cutting short. Margaret Belaine walking the green with purpose, stopping to speak quietly to people who nodded too quickly. Control, Mrs. Hartley thought, was rarely loud. At the churchyard gate, Reed met resistance disguised as concern. Paperwork delayed, keys misplaced, apologies offered warmly. But persistence was its own kind of pressure. By evening, he stood beside the first grave. The soil had settled too evenly. Reed crouched, brushing his fingers lightly across the ground, not digging, not disturbing, simply observing. "This was never opened," he said quietly. Mrs. Hartley stood beside him. No subsidence, no correction. Reed nodded. "You don't get that when a body settles." He straightened. "They buried absence," he said. Mrs. Hartley's voice was calm. "And now they intend to bury truth." The church bell rang once, practice again, or reassurance. Reed looked toward St. Bridget, its stone face unchanged. "The second funeral," he said, "won't just be ceremonial." "No," Mrs. Hartley replied, "it will be definitive." They stood together as dusk crept in, watching Roseford prepare itself for another ending. Only this time, Mrs. Hartley knew, the village was no longer deciding whether the truth would surface, only how much of it could be contained. And beneath the quiet ground, something unresolved waited to be placed where it belonged.
Chapter 8. The Weight of Knowing. The morning of the second funeral arrived without drama. No sudden storms, no bells ringing out of turn. Roseford offered its most convincing performance yet, normality sharpened to a polite edge. Curtains were drawn back, dogs were walked, bread was collected from the baker as if this were any other Thursday. Mrs. Hartley watched the village prepare itself and understood something important. This time, Roseford was not grieving, it was concluding. By the time she reached St. Bridget's, the coffin had already arrived. This one was different. It rested at the front of the church, solid and unmistakably present. Dark wood, proper weight. Nothing symbolic about it. Even from a distance, Mrs. Hartley could see the change in the way people regarded it. Not avoidance now, but attention, a thing finally made real. Inspector Reed stood near the side aisle again, his posture rigid, his expression set. When he saw Mrs. Hartley, he did not nod this time. He waited. "They've done it properly," he murmured when she reached him. "Yes," she replied, "they would." The service began. The vicar spoke with care, too much care. He spoke of rest, of peace, of closure. He spoke as the words themselves might settle what had already resisted burial once before. Mrs. Hartley listened, but she watched instead. Margaret Belaine sat 3 rows back, hands folded, head bowed at precisely the correct angle. She did not look at the coffin for long. She did not need to. This funeral was not for Clara, it was for the village. When the bell rang, it rang on time. When the coffin was carried out, it was borne with visible effort. The pallbearers moved carefully, adjusting their grip, acknowledging weight that could no longer be ignored.
Outside, the grave waited, freshly opened now, unmistakable in its purpose. As the coffin was lowered, the sound it made when it touched the straps was dull and final. No ambiguity remained. Mrs. Hartley felt something release, not relief, but inevitability. This, she thought, was what Roseford had been working toward all along. When it was over, people did not linger. They dispersed quickly, efficiently, like a task completed. Conversations did not resume. There was no murmuring this time, no polite speculation, only movement away. Margaret Belaine did not approach the family. She did not need to. She walked instead toward the green, already recalibrating, already preparing for what came next. Reed exhaled slowly beside Mrs. Hartley. "They've closed the circle," he said. "I think they've drawn it smaller," Mrs. Hartley replied. Reed looked at her sharply. "You think this ends it?" "No," she said. "I think this preserves them." They stood together as the grave-diggers began their work, the sound of soil returning to earth, steady and methodical. "What will you do?" Reed asked. Mrs. Hartley considered the question. "I will remember," she said, "and I will notice." Reed nodded. "That may be all we get." "Yes," she replied, "but it's never nothing." As the churchyard emptied, Mrs. Hartley remained a moment longer. 2 funerals, 1 body, and a village that had finally made its version of events heavy enough to stay buried. She turned to leave just as the bell rang once more, testing, perhaps, or habit asserting itself. It sounded ordinary, and that, Mrs. Hartley knew, was how Roseford would survive this. By letting the truth exist quietly beneath its feet, by insisting it had done what was necessary, and by trusting that most people, most of the time, preferred the comfort of a finished story to the burden of an unfinished one. Mrs. Hartley walked home slowly, already aware that something irreversible had occurred. Roseford had succeeded, but in doing so, it had also taught her exactly how far it was willing to go. And once a village revealed that much about itself, it could never again claim innocence, only order.
Epilogue. What Roseford Learned to Live With. Spring arrived in Roseford without apology. The chestnut tree on the green leafed out as it always had, its branches stretching wider than anyone remembered, its shadow falling where it pleased. The grass recovered its color. The notice board filled again. Bake sales, gardening rotas, committee meetings promising fresh starts without naming what had ended. Life resumed, but not quite as before. The second grave settled differently. Mrs. Hartley noticed it first in the pauses. At the baker's, where conversations stopped half a sentence earlier than they used to. At the church, where sermons leaned heavily on forgiveness but avoided certainty. At the parish hall, where minutes were recorded more carefully and decisions took longer to agree upon. Roseford still believed in kindness. It simply no longer trusted it without inspection. Margaret Belaine did not leave the village. That would have suggested guilt, and Roseford disliked conclusions that loud. She continued to walk the green, continued to attend meetings, but she spoke less, listened more. Her influence loosened, not gone, but no longer unquestioned. People still smiled at her. They just did not step aside quite so quickly. Inspector Reed closed his investigation the only way he could, through procedure rather than resolution. On paper, Clara Whitfield's death remained a suicide. The second funeral required no explanation. There were no charges to bring, no certainty to offer. But Reed did not regret staying as long as he had. Some truths were not meant to be proven.
They were meant to be understood. Mrs. Hartley returned to her routines. She tended her garden, she took her walks, she listened, and she noticed the smallest changes. A young woman who chose to stay when once she might have been encouraged elsewhere. A disagreement allowed to exist without being smoothed into silence. A hesitation now before someone said, "It's for the best." None of it would make headlines, none of it could be measured, but it mattered. One afternoon, Mrs. Hartley walked to the churchyard alone. Clara Whitfield's grave had been kept neatly, not lavishly, but with care. Someone had planted forget-me-nots near the stone, their small blue faces turned toward the light, stubborn and precise. Mrs. Hartley stood for a while, hands folded, listening to the village breathe around her. Roseford would never confess, villages rarely did, but it would remember, uneasily, imperfectly, and altered. And that, Mrs. Hartley thought as she turned for home, was sometimes the only justice a quiet place was capable of offering. Because once a village learned what it was willing to bury, it could never again claim it did not know what lay beneath its feet.
Thank you for spending this quiet hour with me here at the Cozy Mystery Parlor. If Mrs. Elowen Hartley's story stayed with you, if you found yourself listening a little more closely, then I'm glad you were here. If you enjoy thoughtful village mysteries and truths that unfold slowly, consider subscribing. New stories arrive regularly, each in its own time. You're always welcome to like the story if it brought you comfort, and to share it with someone who enjoys a good mystery and a quiet evening. And do tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and what kind of mystery you'd like to hear next. Until next time, pour yourself something warm, keep an eye on the small details, and I'll see you again soon at the Cozy Mystery Parlor.